Let me tell you something, my friends. History is filled with moments where entire empires were shaken not by armies, not by wealth, not by political alliances, but by the power of a single voice. One voice, when it carries truth, conviction, and courage, can become louder than the roar of a superpower. And when that voice comes from a place of unshakable dignity, the world cannot ignore it. That is exactly what happened when one Indian stood tall and refused to bend, even under the weight of America's shadow. Think about it. For decades, the United States has positioned itself as the ultimate authority in international affairs, using its influence, its economy, and its military might to sway nations. But then comes this one individual, armed with nothing more than conviction, standing eye to eye with the world's strongest superpower and saying, "No, we will not bow. We will not compromise who we are just to keep you pleased." That is not arrogance, that is courage. That is leadership. That is the kind of fire that can ignite the spirit of an entire nation. It wasn't about rejecting dialogue or closing doors. No. It was about showing that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. One Indian made it clear that India is not going to be treated like a junior partner, not going to be ordered around like a pawn in somebody else's game. And that moment was bigger than just policy. It was about identity. It was about telling the world, India is not for sale, India is not afraid, India will stand on its own terms, no matter who is standing in front of it. Now, imagine the kind of strength it takes to do that. When you stand against a giant, people expect you to fold. They expect you to compromise, to smile, to bow, and to play along. But when one person decides they will not surrender their principles, it disrupts the script. And the disruption sends shockwaves, not just through political circles, but across the hearts of people watching. It inspires the ordinary man, the ordinary woman, because they see that courage is not about size, it's about spirit. The United States may have walked into that relationship thinking they held the upper hand, thinking that pressure and leverage would bend India to its will. But one Indian proved them wrong. Proved that self-respect is more powerful than any weapon. Proved that dignity is more valuable than dollars. And once that stand was taken, there was no going back to the old dynamic. Something broke. Something shifted. The balance of power was no longer in the hands of the one who thought they had control. It was in the hands of the one who refused to give it away. And here's what I want you to really understand. This wasn't just about politics. It was about sending a message to the entire world. A message that says no nation, no matter how powerful, can silence the voice of one individual who is ready to stand for what is right. That message reverberates beyond borders, beyond governments, and it begins to plant a seed of courage in others. It tells smaller nations that they too can stand tall. It tells the people that leadership is not about pleasing others, it's about protecting your values, your identity, your future. Think of the ripple effect of that one act of defiance. It shook the illusion of American dominance in that relationship. It made other countries stop and think, if India can do this, if one Indian can stand against the most powerful, then what excuse do we have to surrender our dignity? That is how change begins. Not with armies marching, not with treaties signed, but with one person willing to risk it all for the truth. And let me tell you, that kind of courage doesn't just inspire nations, it defines them. Because the power of one voice, when it refuses to be silenced, becomes the power of millions. It becomes the echo that cannot be erased, the example that cannot be forgotten. It tells the world that superpowers may have strength, but true power lies in conviction. So when we look back at that moment, we don't just see a clash between two nations. We see the rise of a new standard. We see that one Indian proved a simple but unshakable truth. You don't have to be the biggest to be the strongest. You don't have to have the most weapons to win the fight. Sometimes, all it takes is one voice that refuses to break. And that voice destroyed the illusion of control, shattered the balance of power, and reminded the world that courage is the ultimate weapon. Because in the end, it was not America that stood taller. Let me tell you something. Diplomacy is often painted as this elegant dance of words, where leaders shake hands, exchange smiles, and agree to terms that may not always reflect what they truly believe. It's a game of compromise where nations give up a little piece of themselves in order to keep the relationship going, even if that means sacrificing integrity. But there comes a point when compromise crosses the line into submission, when maintaining ties becomes more important than protecting your principles. And that's when someone has to step up and say, enough. That is exactly what one Indian did, and in doing so, he proved that integrity will always outweigh diplomacy. You see, the United States has been used to dealing with countries that will bend under pressure. With the right incentives or the right threats, they've managed to dictate terms and walk away with the upper hand. That's how superpowers operate. They expect obedience disguised as cooperation. But when this one Indian stood in front of them, there was no bending, no sugarcoating, no smiling while signing away the nation's dignity. Instead, there was honesty, there was clarity. There was a refusal to sell out the future for the sake of pleasing someone in the present. That is not just political bravery, that is moral courage. Because integrity is not about saying what people want to hear. Integrity is about saying what must be said, even if it costs you relationships, even if it makes others uncomfortable. And when this man spoke, it became clear that India was not interested in being a decorative ally, a silent partner that nods along while America calls the shots. India wanted to stand on equal footing, and equal footing does not come from diplomacy without backbone. It comes from integrity, from sticking to your values even when it shakes the foundations of the relationship. Now imagine the shock on the other side. They weren't expecting resistance. They weren't expecting someone to call out the double standards, the hypocrisy, the manipulation. But that is exactly what happened. One Indian refused to play the game the way America wanted it played. And the cost was clear. The relationship suffered, ties weakened, trust evaporated. But here's the thing, sometimes that price is worth paying. Because losing a partnership built on control is better than keeping it at the cost of your self-respect. People often say diplomacy is about being smart, being flexible, being adaptable. But what good is flexibility if it makes you spendless? What good is adaptability if it makes you lose who you are? True diplomacy is not about how much you can bend, it's about how well you can stand. And in that moment, India stood. It did not allow itself to be boxed in by promises or intimidated by threats. And it was all because one Indian had the courage to say, we will not sacrifice what we believe just to keep this relationship alive. And this is what separates real leadership from weak politics. Weak politics settles for short-term peace, even if it means long-term loss of dignity. Real leadership risks conflict in the present to safeguard respect in the future. That's what integrity looks like. It doesn't chase applause, it doesn't chase approval, it doesn't chase easy wins. It chases what is right, no matter the cost. And because of that, America realized in that moment that India cannot be bought, cannot be pressured, cannot be turned into a puppet. This stand wasn't just about U.S. India relations. It was about setting a global example, because the world was watching, smaller nations were watching, allies were watching. And they saw that if India could say no to the United States, if one Indian could hold firm against the strongest power in the world, then integrity still has a place in global politics. That kind of example does not fade. It stays in the minds of leaders and citizens alike, reminding them that standing up for your principles is always more valuable than shaking hands on a hollow deal. And let me tell you, it takes far more strength to walk away from an unfair agreement than to sign it for the sake of peace. It takes far more courage to risk a fallout than to plaster over cracks with false smiles. That's why integrity will always outweigh diplomacy, because diplomacy without integrity is just deception. But integrity, even without diplomacy, is power. So when the dust settles and history looks back at that moment, it will not remember the strained ties, the broken deals, or the political fallout. It will remember that one Indian showed the world that respect is not negotiated at the table. It is earned by standing firm when others expect you to bend. And that single act turned what could have been another diplomatic compromise into a lesson for generations. Because in the end, integrity is the only diplomacy that lasts. The world we live in is not static. Power shifts, alliances change, and the balance of influence is constantly being reshaped. But every once in a while, a moment comes along that doesn't just adjust the balance slightly, it redraws the entire map. That's what happened when one Indian stood against the pressure of the United States and refused to be dictated to. It wasn't just a disagreement. It wasn't just a diplomatic fallout. It was the birth of a new global equation, a moment that forced the world to see India in a way it had never been seen before. For decades, the U.S. has operated with the assumption that its word carries final authority. Nations listened, nodded, and obeyed. Sometimes willingly, sometimes reluctantly, because the power imbalance left them little choice. But that illusion shattered the day India, through one man's defiance, made it clear that it would not play by America's rules. And when that illusion broke, the global chessboard suddenly looked different. Because if one of the rising giants could say no, then the hierarchy itself was no longer untouchable. This was not about hostility, and it was not about burning bridges. It was about rewriting the terms of engagement. India was no longer content to be labeled as a junior partner, an ally in name but a subordinate in practice. No, this was India declaring itself as an equal force, willing to walk away from relationships that didn't recognize its dignity. That act, that refusal, forced everyone else watching, Europe, Asia, Africa, even smaller nations, to reconsider the way global power is structured. Suddenly, it wasn't a one-way street with the United States at the center. It became a multipolar reality, one where nations like India had the power to set their own terms. And let's be clear, this wasn't just about India versus America. This was about a changing tide across the globe. Countries are tired of being lectured to, tired of being pressured into choices that serve someone else's agenda. When India stood firm, it gave those countries a mirror, a model, an example that said, you can hold your ground too. You can demand respect, not just request it. That ripple effect is what gives this moment its historic weight. Because once the precedent is set, it can't be undone. America now knows that India cannot be controlled. The rest of the world knows it too. And when that truth settles in, the entire equation shifts. Instead of one power dictating and the rest following, the system becomes a balance of independent nations, each with its own voice, each with its own leverage. That is the birth of a new world order, not through war, not through conquest, but through the courage of one voice refusing to break. You see, people think global equations are written in treaties and signed in summits. But the truth is, they are written in moments of defiance, in acts of principle that send shockwaves far beyond a single meeting room. One Indian, by standing for integrity, redrew the lines of power. Suddenly, India wasn't just participating in global affairs, it was shaping them. And once you shape the game, you are no longer a player. You are a power in your own right. Think about how this will echo through the future. Trade deals will be negotiated differently. Alliances will be viewed differently. Even adversaries will treat India differently because they know now that this is not a country that bends to threats or bribes. This is a nation that will walk its own path, no matter how much pressure is applied. That knowledge alone changes the way the world interacts with India. It forces respect even from those who may not want to give it. And that's the real beauty of it. Respect earned through strength lasts far longer than partnerships built on submission. A nation that commands respect writes its own destiny, while a nation that chases approval is forever chained to someone else's agenda. By taking that stand, by sparking this shift, India crossed over into a new identity. It stopped being seen as a developing country finding its way and started being seen as a global force shaping the way forward. So when we call this the birth of a new global equation, it is not exaggeration, it is the truth. The balance of power tilted, the rules of the game changed, and the world had to accept that a new player was not just entering the room, but demanding a seat at the head of the table. That kind of shift does not happen often, and when it does, it defines the era. And that is exactly what this moment will be remembered for. Not as a clash that broke ties, but as the turning point when one Indian's courage forced the world to respect India as a power that stands on its own. Because in the end, the equation is simple. Those who cannot be controlled will always be the ones who truly lead.